The wind howls along the jagged cliffs of their small coastal town, a place where the Atlantic waves crash relentlessly against the ancient stones. This was the world Elena and Julian shared, a landscape where dreams were often as fleeting as the morning mist. They were childhood sweethearts, their souls bound together by a shared history of salty air and whispered secrets. Julian was a visionary, a man who saw the world in grand lines and soaring structures, sketching intricate blueprints on the back of grease-stained napkins at the local diner. But Julian had nothing but his talent. His family's pockets were empty, and his dreams of becoming an architect seemed destined to remain buried in the coastal sand. Elena, however, saw a fire in him that she refused to let go out. She loved him with a devotion that transcended her own needs, seeing his potential as a light that could lead them both out of their modest beginnings. She began working double shifts, arriving at the diner before the sun touched the horizon and leaving long after the stars had claimed the sky. Every penny she earned, every tip she scraped from the pockets of weary fishermen, was tucked away into a small tin box under her bed. It was Julian's future. When the day finally came for him to leave for the capital, the air at the train station was thick with the scent of coal smoke. Julian gripped her hands, his eyes bright with the promise of tomorrow. He swore that his success would be their success, that he was going to build a palace for her in the city. "Wait for me," he whispered as the whistle blew. "Everything I do for us." The next 5 years were a marathon of solitude and sacrifice. Elena lived a life of extreme frugality, surviving on little more than bread and tea. Each month, she sent the bulk of her earnings to the city, covering Julian's tuition, his expensive supplies, and his living expenses. She grew thin, the youthful glow of her face replaced by the sharp lines of a woman who knew the physical weight of labor. Yet, she didn't complain. She had his letters, which arrived daily in the beginning, filled with passionate declarations of love. But as Julian began to climb the professional ladder, the ink seemed to dry up. The daily letters became weekly, then monthly, eventually transforming into brief. Cold notes filled with excuses about busy schedules. He was no longer the boy who sketched on napkins. He was becoming a man she barely recognized through the paper. Then, on a Tuesday like any other, an anonymous envelope arrived. Inside was a gold-embossed invitation to a high-profile architectural gala in the city. Julian was being honored as Architect of the Year, the crowning achievement of the career she had bought for him. Her heart soared with pride. This was the moment he would finally call her to his side. She spent her meager savings on a modest navy blue dress and a bus ticket, her mind swirling with visions of their reunion. She imagined him pulling her into his arms, telling her that the long years of waiting were finally over. The bus ride to the city was long, but Elena didn't mind. She watched the rugged coastline disappear, replaced by the glittering lights of the urban sprawl. When she finally stepped into the grand ballroom of the city's hotel, she felt like a ghost haunting a palace. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of elite conversation. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she searched the crowd. Finally, her eyes landed on him. Julian stood at the center of the room, draped in a suit that cost more than a year of her labor. He looked magnificent, polished, and foreign. He was a stranger in a world she didn't recognize, and as he laughed with a group of socialites, a cold shiver of dread began to settle in Elena's chest. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The chandelier's light was too bright, reflecting off the polished marble in a way that made Elena's head spin. She clutched her small worn clutch bag, feeling the calluses on her fingers, a stark contrast to the soft manicured hands of the women swirling around her. Her navy blue dress, which had seemed so elegant in the dim light of her bedroom back home, now felt drab and heavy, a visual confession of her poverty. She was a shadow in a room of neon lights, an invisible woman wandering through a labyrinth of wealth. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of elite conversation that she couldn't hope to join. Every laugh from the crowd felt like a sharp jab at her pride, and every glance from a stranger seemed to assess her and find her wanting. Then she saw him. Julian wasn't just attending the gala. He was the sun around which the entire room orbited, and at his side, like a moon reflecting his newfound glory, was Clara. Clara was everything Elena was not. Willowy, dressed in a gown of shimmering silk that looked like liquid gold and possessed of a confidence that only comes from a lifetime of luxury. They stood joined at the hip, their bodies leaning into one another with an intimacy that felt like a physical blow to Elena's chest. Julian laughed at something Clara whispered into his ear, his eyes bright with a hunger for the prestige he now inhabited. He looked like he had never known a day of hunger or a night of doubt. Elena's feet moved before her mind could protest. She navigated the sea of silk and tuxedos, her heart drumming a frantic, painful rhythm. When she finally stood before him, the air between them seemed to freeze. Julian's laughter died instantly. His face, once so warm and familiar, turned a ghostly, ashen pale. There was no joy in his eyes, only a flickering, panicked embarrassment. He didn't reach out to touch her. Instead, he took a half-step back, as if trying to create distance between his polished present and his dusty past. The silence stretched until it was almost unbearable. A colleague of Julian's, a man with a sharp suit, broke the suffocating tension. He looked at Elena's modest attire and asked Julian who his charming guest was. The pause that followed was agonizing. Julian's throat moved as he swallowed hard, his gaze darting to Clara before landing momentarily on Elena. He didn't call her his partner or the woman who had sacrificed her youth for his dreams. Instead, he forced a tight, artificial smile and introduced her merely as an old friend from his hometown who had helped him in the very beginning. The words felt like a serrated blade across her spirit. To him, she was a footnote, a temporary scaffolding he had discarded now that the structure was complete. The humiliation deepened when the master of ceremonies took the stage. Julian and Clara were called up together, their hands entwined as the crowd erupted in applause. To the cheers of the city's elite, they announced their engagement. Julian caught Elena's eye for a fleeting second from the stage, but he didn't offer a look of apology. He looked away quickly, his chin held high, fully embracing the lie he was living. Elena felt the floor beneath her sway, the world she had built around her love for him crumbling into dust. Fleeing the applause, Elena found him later in a quiet, dimly lit hallway. The mask of the professional architect slipped for a moment, replaced by a defensive coldness. Elena confronted him, her voice trembling with the weight of 5 years of sacrifice. She spoke of the money, the meals she had skipped, and the promises he had made at the station. Julian didn't flinch. He adjusted his cufflinks, claiming they were now from different worlds. "I need someone who matches my current stature, Elena," he said, his tone dripping with clinical cruelty. "I need a partner who understands this life, not someone who reminds me of where I started." Before she could respond, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick, white envelope. He pressed it into her hand, an interest payment for her years of help, and told her to go back home and find someone more her speed. The white envelope felt heavier than all the thousands of dollars Elena had sent to the capital. It was a cold attempt to settle a debt that could never be measured in currency. She looked at the man standing before her, the man whose tuition she had paid, whose rent she had covered, and whose dreams she had nourished with her own exhaustion. He looked back at her with a mixture of pity and impatience, his hand still hovering as if he expected her to kiss his ring in gratitude. In that moment, the last lingering thread of her devotion snapped. She didn't see a soulmate. She saw a hollow shell. She didn't scream, and she didn't beg. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked back into the grand lobby, where the air was thick with the scent of lilies. In the center of the foyer stood a magnificent marble fountain. Elena didn't hesitate. She tore the envelope open, the sound of paper ripping like a gunshot. She tossed the stacks of bills into the water. She watched as the ink blurred and the paper grew heavy, sinking to the bottom of the basin like the dead weight of their history. Julian, who had followed her, stood frozen by the columns, his face a mask of disbelief. He couldn't understand why she would discard the thing he worshipped. Elena didn't offer an explanation. She walked through the glass doors and out into the biting city air, her head held higher than it had been in 5 long years. The bus ride back to the coast was a journey through the wreckage of her old life. As the neon lights of the city faded, the grief that had threatened to drown her began to transform. The tears came, yes, but they were not for the man who had betrayed her. They were for the girl who had worked double shifts until her feet bled, all for a ghost who never truly existed. When she reached her hometown, the clarity was absolute. She wasn't returning as a victim. She was returning as a survivor who finally owned her own future. Back in the small coastal town, Elena didn't retreat into the shadows. She took the work ethic that had built Julian's career and turned it toward her own life. She used her remaining savings to lease a derelict, salt-crusted building on the harbor front. She sanded wood and painted walls herself. Within months, she opened a boutique cafe that celebrated the beauty of the Atlantic. It wasn't just a business, it was her rebirth. She was no longer the woman waiting for a call. She was the woman the town looked to for inspiration. Miles away, Julian lived the life he had traded his soul for. His glass office overlooked the city, but the view felt like a prison. His marriage to Clara was a series of cold negotiations. He was architect of the year, yet he owned nothing, not even his own designs, which were dictated by his father-in-law's greed. He would often sit in the silence of his luxury apartment, staring at an old, blurred photograph of a beach, feeling a crushing, hollow loneliness. He had the stature he wanted, but he had lost the only person who had ever truly known him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon in a blaze of violet and orange, Elena walked along the shore. The waves crashed against the rocks, but she no longer felt the need to fight the tide. She realized that Julian hadn't been her destination. He had been the wind that forced her to find her own sails. She was finally free, not because she had won him back, but because she had found the person she was always meant to be.